If you're serious about a career in 3D animation, or if you just want to make the most out of your newfound hobby, making things move around on the computer, the best advice I can give you if you're truly wanting to become a great animator is this: learn the traditional principles of animation. The tried and true techniques that Walt Disney and his world-class team of animators developed way back in the late 1920s. You see, when Disney was starting out, he and his hand-picked team of artists came to the realization that for the motion that they would create to look realistic, for the audience to truly believe what they were seeing, certain techniques, certain little added-in elements had to be applied when animating everything. And I mean everything, from the most detailed character to something as simple as bouncing a ball or showing a leaf falling gently to the ground. It would be those little extra add-ons that would, over the years, stand the test of time, coming to be known as the principles of animation. Your animations will never look as realistic and believable as they could if you don't apply those same principles. Now, inasmuch as an in-depth discussion of the principles would take weeks, if not months, and maybe show you a couple of examples to drive home how important they are in bringing out the highest level of believability to a scene. Let's start with the principle of anticipation. Simply put, anticipation is a preliminary action that sets up a primary action. It's used to cue or prepare the audience for what is about to happen. Here, watching the character swing his arms back and forth, we anticipate. Anticipate that he'll thrust his weight forward as he jumps. The preliminary action is his forward and back arm swings. The primary action is the jumping motion itself. Now, we could have just shown the guy jumping forward without the proper anticipation, but how would that look? The jumping movement wouldn't have the same impact or appeal as it would by leading into the jump with the swinging arms. The arm movement cued us in on what was about to happen. There's also the principle of squash and stretch. It's defined as saying that no matter how much an object deforms, it must always maintain the same apparent volume, or mass. It stays the same amount, in other words. The principle of squash and stretch is used in animation to illustrate just how dense or rigid an object is. If this character was, let's say, carrying around a little extra weight around his midsection, you'd expect that extra weight to move and shift around as he jumped up and down. I've always said that if it wiggles, it better when animated also jiggle. Softer objects deform when either shifting direction abruptly or coming into contact with something harder. Their shape can change, but the amount of that shape stays the same. That's the concept of squash and stretch. So if this was a lighter character, maybe not carrying around quite as much weight, we wouldn't expect to see quite as much squash, then weight shift as if it was a larger individual. The larger character's weight would shift with his movements, but the amount of weight wouldn't change. Not unless he was planning on doing quite a bit of jumping. Another Disney principle is one called follow-through, which states that an object in motion almost never comes to a complete and sudden stop. It instead has a tendency to actually travel past its termination point, then slowly reverse direction before coming to a final rest. As the character slips on the floor, falling onto his back, notice how when making contact with the floor, he doesn't just stop, but instead follows through. His weight and body parts shifting back and forth before finally coming to a rest. That movement, once having made contact with the floor, would be considered the follow-through. Think how unrealistic that fall would have looked if when the character hit the floor, he just stuck like landing in glue. Him following through made for a more believable, albeit painful, fall. There's also a principle known as overlapping action that states that not everything happens all at the same time. No, when something moves, there's usually a series of smaller actions that overlap or combine together to create the overall motion. Look at the way this character is jumping into the air to do the splits. The complete action is broken down into a series of smaller actions or movements that overlap and combine together to create the overall mid-air acrobatics. The character on the ground, him up in the air, his legs together then stretched out. It all overlaps, not everything happening all at the same time. That's what the principle of overlapping action implies. Then there's secondary action, which is defined as an action that's a direct result from another action. This happened because that happened, in other words. The only reason why this character jumped out of his seat was because of something happening. A touchdown scored, a three-point shot to win the game, his horse winning the race. Something initiated him standing up. Secondary action is a kind of cause and effect if you want to think about it that way. This, something exciting, caused that, him getting off his butt for a round of applause. The reaction to what happened was the secondary action. The next principle, and I'm sure you're familiar with the term, is exaggeration, which is added to a movement to accentuate the action or idea, to bring it out, in other words. Exaggeration is used to ensure that the audience doesn't miss an important element or action within a shot, making sure that what's happening on screen isn't too subtle or feels more or less inconsequential. Watching the way this guy's throwing a fit, I think it's pretty clear that he's a little upset. To underscore just how ticked off he is, his movements are exaggerated to drive home the point of his anger, something you want to make sure gets across to the audience. So add exaggeration where needed to drive home the point so the audience doesn't miss it. And lastly, we have the traditional principle of staging, which probably has more to do with composition or scene layout than anything else. Staging simply states that important objects in a scene should be positioned in a way in which they're quickly detected and easily understood, something professional photographers know all too well with each and every shot they take. You never want your primary area of focus to be obscured or in any way misinterpreted. Good staging will keep that from happening. So here, with the character performing his exercises behind the yellow pole, it's not just a little tough to see what he's doing, but it's frankly kind of distracting. Not being able to clearly focus on what is obviously the most important thing in the shot. To substantially improve things, all you have to do is move the pole off to the side. We can then clearly see our character getting a good workout. So with staging, make things easy to see and understand. So that'll give you a few of the most important Disney traditional principles to get a grip on. Now, I'm telling you, I've seen far too many new animators, for whatever reason, seem to want to downplay just how essential these principles are. Don't let yourself fall into the same trap. You gotta not just know this stuff, no, more importantly, you gotta apply it to your work. You do that, and you'll be many steps closer to getting people to recognize the talent that you have as a 3D animator.